Hi folks, Canadian Prepper here. So today on the channel, we're going to be talking about a poll I recently did. And that poll asked, what is your greatest fear in an SHTF situation for you and your family and friends? The options were as follows: starvation and malnutrition, i.e. no food; security threats, i.e. violence; dying of exposure, that is no heat or no cooling if you live in a very hot place; dehydration, no water; disease, no medical. We're going to talk about the survey coming right up. Let's get to it. All right, guys, so before we dive in here, I'll kindly ask, if you enjoy this type of content and you've watched many of my videos before, but you're not a subscriber yet, please click the subscribe button. We're almost at 500,000 subs. You can help us get there. It's been a long uphill battle this last 6 years. We got the headwinds of all things algorithmic in front of us, if you know what I'm saying. And apparently a lot of people have been getting unsubbed unknowingly. And I'm not the only channel this happens to. This happens to a lot of channels. Nobody apparently knows why this happens. It just seems to happen. But that's okay. That's okay, because I would rather have a hard-earned subscriber, somebody who I had to, win their trust, than somebody who just clicked subscribe for the hell of it and never watched a video again. So I do appreciate your viewership, and let's take this channel to 1 million. Let's get a prepping channel out there to 1 million subs. That would be absolutely amazing. And I think the times that we're living in, if there's not a prepping channel with 1 million subs, then something is seriously, seriously wrong. So let's talk about this survey that I did, shall we? So not surprisingly, security threats and violence came in at 52%, and all of the other ones came in at under 20%, with dying exposure coming in only at 3%. Okay, so that's rather interesting. If you remember the rule of threes, what is it? 3 seconds without a self-defense, okay? In a split second, something can happen. You can get clipped. 3 minutes without air. And I would also say 3 minutes without a gas mask if you're in a contaminated region. 3 hours without medical attention for acute emergencies. 3 days without water. 3 weeks without food. There is a whole plethora of the rule of threes, a rule of thumb, that basically are there to indicate, what we need in order to survive. Part of the reason why security threats and violence comes in at the top of the list, there's a few reasons. One is the imminence of it, the fact that it is imminent. It's one of the things that can take you out quickest. Yes, you can starve to death, but it'll take maybe 4 to 6 weeks. Yes, you can die of exposure. It'll probably take 3 hours, and that's the other one, dying of exposure, lack of shelter. If you don't have shelter and it's freezing cold out, chances are you got about 3 hours until you go into hypothermia or you just freeze to death. Dehydration is going to take a few days, and even disease, the progression of, could take anywhere from 48 hours to, 3 months, depending on what the nature of the disease was. So security threats and violence are the ones that really grab people's attention and really motivate people to prepare, because it is the most intense and arguably unpredictable set of circumstances that you could be in. It's one of the few things on this list that really gets people's adrenaline up. Now, what I found is that if you focus on physical fitness, if you focus on self-defense, if you focus on learning how to defend yourself using other types of tools, if you catch my drift, then you can likely sleep better at night. But it's not surprising that this is people's main motivation. Now, if you were to give this poll to a group of non-preppers, perhaps they would rank that somewhere else on the list. But I do think that really depends on how well they've been primed. I used to do psychological research at a graduate level, and what we found is that if you were to show somebody a video or something like that before they took a survey, it could drastically alter the results of the survey. So if you, maybe showed people the movie The Road, right before giving them this survey, then chances are, security threats and violence are going to be on the top of the list. Whereas if you were to show them a video of what was some movie where a person was, dying of the freezing cold, it was a survival situation in winter, dying of exposure might come up higher on the list. But overall, this is fairly reflective of the prepping population, because we've got 17,000 votes. That's just a huge amount of votes, and 700 comments. That's unbelievable. So thanks a lot for participating. The interesting thing with all this, though, is that dying of exposure is probably one of the most common ways that people go in a survival situation. And especially if you live in a cold climate, that's the first thing that's going to go. If the power was to go down where I live in the wintertime, the first thing that is going to start taking people out is going to be the cold. It's not going to be security threats and violence, because all the bad guys, they're all going to just be trying to keep warm, unless they're trying to get into a place where they know that there's going to be fuel or another way that they can keep warm. But chances are the inverse of this survey is going to take place, okay? Starvation is likely going to be the last thing that gets a lot of people, believe it or not. It's going to be dehydration, the lack of water for the majority of people, especially in the United States, where there's not as much fresh water as there is in Canada. There's a lot of cities that rely on the grid to get water into homes and to sustain these large populations. And of course, disease is definitely going to be a more time-release thing, but there's a lot of people who require medications in order to live. There's going to be a lot of waterborne pathogens that are going to take people out because you don't properly filter or boil your water. So while I can understand security threats and violence being a prime motivator, and I myself probably would have put that one on there as well, even though I know that it's likely going to be one of these other things that are going to present one of the biggest challenges. So let's go read some comments that I've selected here from the survey and see what you guys have to say about this. Now, just so you guys know, if you don't indicate in the comment what your selection was, I'll never know. This is a completely anonymous set of surveys. Obviously, YouTube and Google knows, but I personally don't know. So to me, it's just aggregate data. But it's still interesting to see people comment, and sometimes people will let on what they actually voted for. 52% of people, of course, in this instance voted for violence. So let's see what Dave Samuels has to say. I'm closer to 60 than to 50. So my greatest fear is none of the things in the survey. My greatest fear is that I might be too slow when needed. Too slow to think, too slow to punch, too slow to duck, shoot, break, so on and so on. The only thing I do more quickly as time marches on is too embarrassing to mention. It's true what they say. Getting old ain't for, I'm not going to say the word because the video will be demonetized, but I totally get what this guy is saying, and I can understand how when you start to get up there in age, you have to question your physical capabilities. But what I will say to this, I think what older people, if you want to say that, I mean, that's a relative term, between 50 and 60, not really old in my books. You got a lot of people pushing 100 nowadays. So, I mean, you still got quite a ways to go, Dave. But I will say that you can make up for it in wisdom. Even when I meet really intelligent young people, there's still a certain juvenile naivete to those people, even if they are like technically smarter than me, like people with a higher IQ. A good example of that is Lex Friedman. He's a guy who I think is very intelligent. You know, he interviews physicists, mathematicians, computer scientists, all these people. I listen to his podcasts all the time, don't always agree with what he says, but I do also find that there's a certain naivete and a sort of boyish fascination with the world, which is great. It's great to have that creative drive when you're young. But at the same time, you know, even if you're not the most smartest person on paper, as you age, you get that wisdom, you get that experience. You kind of know what's going to work and what's not going to work, what's futile. And you just seem to have a better intuition about what is likely to come of whatever given event. And also, as your testosterone lowers, you're less likely to get yourself in different predicaments that I think younger people would be more apt to get themselves into. You're taking greater risks, perhaps, risks that you needn't take. You know, your ego kind of gets in the way when you're young. You still got something to prove. And I think when you get up there in age, you kind of, I would assume anyways, I'm at the halfway point myself. I think we're just a bit more measured, a bit more calm, and not so quick to fly off the handle, definitely. So that's something you got going for you. Godlike Machine says, I live in the countryside with a river, woods, garden, and several guns. So the only thing that worries me is medical supplies, especially since I'm a type 1 diabetic. Ironically, that's the only thing that worries me right now in my current situation. LOL. Some gallows humor at the end there. It's good to try to stay positive even in light of this. I'm sure there are substitutes for diabetes. I personally don't have it. I haven't really fully researched the topic, but I'm sure there has to be some medicinal alternative. If anybody knows, in the comment section below, please add your comment so this person can go and research that. Of course, I can't attest to everything that people write in the comment section, especially as it pertains to medical issues, but maybe it can direct that person in the right place to find some kind of substitute, because indeed, without medicine, guys, a lot of people who have grown dependent on those medicines to basically keep themselves alive are going to be in a whole heap of trouble. So you definitely have to make that a top priority if that's something that you struggle with. Joey Skull says, not being able to trust people you were once able to trust. Sadly. Yeah, and that begs the question, could you ever trust those people in the first place? But I get what you mean. When the chips are down, as a Joker would say, will people turn on each other? Are those, your coworker that you just kind of dislike a little bit, are they actually going to become a serious problem in your life, beyond just being a little annoying? I often say that people's personalities are going to become amplified in an SHTF situation. So if you got beef with somebody now, chances are that's going to amplify into something a lot more serious, as it would in the jungles of somewhere thousands and thousands of years ago, right? Up next, Ivor the Insane, a little bit of irony with this one, says violence. Just look at how people already act towards one another. It will be tenfold in an SHTF situation. Well, Ivor the Insane, that kind of sounds like the pot calling the kettle black, but I'm just joking. So, no, I do think that you're right. Those things are going to be amplified, like I just said, absolutely. Life Outside the Box says, my greatest fear is letting the vile, heartless monster that lives within me out to survive and keep my close ones safe. That's a very interesting one, because he's talking about how he realizes, or she, or whoever it is, realizes that they have the ability to do things in order to survive, which may go against their own morals. And the question becomes, do you do those things even though they are against your own morals? How do you rationalize doing those things to protect the people that you need to protect? Because we've all seen the various ethical dilemmas that present themselves in post-apocalyptic movies, where the good guy is forced to do something bad in order to take care of his family. So indeed, getting put in one of those positions is something nobody wants to do, and all the more reason to be prepared so you never have to put yourself in that situation. But the fact is, somebody may come at you and you may have to defend yourself. And contrary to the prevailing view that you're just going to be mowing down zombies, you have a conscience. Most people have a conscience. And I like how it was depicted in the movie Greenland, where the guy has to actually defend himself and he kills two people, and he wrestles with that for the rest of the movie. They humanized the victims in that movie. Oftentimes in those apocalyptic movies, people are just dropping like flies, and the value of life gets supremely reduced. But that movie kind of took a different approach. Leanda61 says, in SHTF, my greatest fear is not my own death, rather how death would leave my family defenseless and exploitable with separation and great suffering. I would have to concur 110% with that estimation, because I myself too don't fear death. I don't fear what's on the other side per se. I'm sure nobody wants to, be in severe pain in their final hours, but I'm more concerned with what happens to the people who are dependent on me after I go. That's probably one of my main motivations at this point in my life. It has very little to do with myself personally and just surviving for the sake of surviving. I'm well beyond that motivation. I don't want to just survive just to survive. I would like at least my life to be a means to help somebody. Steve Lindbergh, baby. Medical conditions and lack of proper medicine. Absolutely. We already talked about that one, but it's very important. Mike Moon says, when you have a family on critical medication to survive, it's a very scary thought. And especially if they're immobile, do you leave them behind or hunker down with them and become a target of violence? And I guess that's a conversation that would have to be had with those particular people at some point. There's going to be a lot of situations, unfortunately, where people are perhaps even bedridden and immobilized. And if you were to stay in that location, you're going to be putting more vulnerable people at risk. I'm talking about children and other family members. So that's a call at some point that people are going to have to make, and it's a conversation that's going to have to be had. Not a lot of people are going to budge on that because, most people are just not going to want to do that, and understandably so. And most people are not going to want to leave. David Gaines says violence because others will experience all the rest quicker as they are unprepared, and it will push them to violence. I expect others to be desperate to the point of violence long before I run out of food or water. That's an excellent point. And again, it's all about how other people are going to be using violence as a means to procure all the stuff that we as preppers have, right? Brad Grand says, nothing has the ability to kill you faster than a lack of security at the wrong moment. And I think that's why that 3-second rule of thumb exists, at 3 seconds without self-defense is basically a life or death situation. Pimpity Pimpster 99 says, I spend a lot of time in Saskatchewan prairies in the winter. I've become obsessed with all types of heaters and stoves. And so I think that guy probably was one of the 3% of people who selected the fear of dying of exposure. But I think that one is the one which is most grounded in reality, at least in the place I live. It's certainly not going to be in a lot of places where there's huge populations, because most big cities are in places where it's not impossible to freeze to death, but there's more warm days in the year than there is cold days. So it's not surprising that it wasn't a very popular pick. Lachlan Fuller, this was a very thoughtful one. I know so many people talk about it, but even still, nobody really takes it to heart or pays much attention to it. Getting a very small, tiny scratch and getting it infected would be massive and extremely deadly. You may think, well, I get cuts and such every day and I'm fine, but you don't realize in an SHTF situation, you aren't going to have things like showers, washing your hands, clean water. And I'll also add to this, I cut the comment off there, so I can't read the whole thing, but you're also not going to have nutrients. You're going to be vitamin deficient. You're going to be stressed out. You're not going to have the proper rest. So indeed, one of those scratches that you would get in, everyday situation here while the grid is up could easily morph into a big, painful problem. We've talked about different remedies for infections. If you can't get a prescription for antibiotics, there's other things you can do. Go and explore the search bar on my channel's homepage and you'll find some information on that. Just search for antibiotics. Marielle Martinez says mental problems. I'm sure she's meaning mental health problems, just to be PC about that. Fighting with them because of everything and because of nothing. Mental health may be your biggest issue. The other ones you may be able to handle. The one is more tricky. And indeed, if you have anxiety disorder, if you have a psychosis, or if you're on some sort of antipsychotic medication, anti-anxiety medication, any sorts of psychological medication that you're on, there's going to be a withdrawal period, and that can cause some pretty adverse effects, at least until you are able to detox from those substances. But many of these are things that you need in order to keep you stable. If you are immediately pulled off of antidepressants, you're going to be very depressed in an already depressing situation, which could lead to some suicidal ideation and stuff like that. So you definitely want to have some sort of solution if you do struggle with the mental health thing. There are certain substitutes that you can get. I'm not going to get too much into the weeds there. I've talked about mental health before, but there may be natural alternatives, or there may be artificial alternatives that you yourself can create to replicate the effects of the medication that you're on. Because we need to remember that a good chunk of North America is on psychiatric medication. And when that stuff stops rolling out, if and when it stops rolling out, there's going to be problems, okay? Sebastian Bolduc says, having to leave family behind, friends, because they're too much of a risk due to many factors. I'm not referring to age, illness, and capabilities, by the way. Okay, this is an interesting one. That should never be a factor. Okay, that's interesting that he says that, and that kind of reinforces what I was saying earlier about how, a lot of people are just not going to have those as an excuse, the fact that somebody is incapable. But he does say more along the lines of stupidity, not working together as a team, not being able to compromise, bad decision making, lack of situational awareness. So here he's talking about people who just are in a large part liabilities. And you may be tasked with having to abandon certain family, extended family, and friends. Alan Larmore says, you forgot no Facebook. How could you? People would be throwing themselves off the roof without Facebook. Yes, a digital forced detox may be actually good for the world, but indeed, there's going to be a lot of people in cell phone withdrawal. A whole generation of people who grew up in a virtual space are no longer going to have that as cover, and they're going to have to interact in the real world with other people. That could get quite interesting, okay? That animalism could just like pop right out of them instantly when their needs are not met. And I actually anticipate that something like that likely would happen. The fact that we're all stuck in these virtual bubbles and everybody's living and working remotely, to go from that to having to get up close and personal with every survival aspect of life instantly, is probably going to cause a lot of mental duress for people. And it could cause a lot of, maybe not psychotic breaks, but just people acting recklessly and making impulsive decisions. Christy Rucker says, the choice most people are picking makes sense as it's the least predictable and controllable. And yeah, and that's a time thing, right? Because starvation, you got time. Dehydration, you got time. Medication, all these things you have time. But self-defense and violence, those things are right now. So excellent point, Chrissy. One last one here. I'm the one you warned me of. Okay, at least he's honest. I noticed that the highest ranking one so far is violence. If you have a good defense, you should be fine. My main worry is water. You can have all the guns in the world, great medical kit, blankets, firewood stacked 10 feet high, and food stacked to the rafters. But if the grid goes down, you're most likely going to lose your water because it runs on pumps. If you don't have fresh water, you will die, plain and simple. Absolutely agree. 3 days without water is no joke. So everybody needs to have a plan as to how they're going to store water or how you're going to get water. If you live by a river, okay, that's fine. But do you live a mile from the river? Are you going to be able to, go to the river? Are you going to have the means to haul water? Okay, so these are all things that you have to think about. So long as there's a water source nearby and you have adequate filtration capabilities, and there's other ways that we've talked about to get water on this channel. I'm going to do a full updated video on that pretty soon. Then you should be okay, but definitely that should be on the number one on your priority list. So I guess what I'm getting here today, the vibe I'm getting with a lot of people, is that people are aware that these other things are likely going to take them out first: starvation, water, etc., medical supplies. But at the same time, there still is that fear of violence, which I think is probably ingrained in our DNA in some ways, because when we were coming up thousands of years ago, that was the main thing that we were worried about, was being eaten by a wild cat or, clubbed by a fellow caveman or even cave woman. Got to be equal opportunity, right? I'm not sure if they were that equal opportunity then. I wonder if they had pronouns and stuff back then. Who knows? Anyways, I highly doubt it, because I think it was just grunts and groans. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. And there was one thing that wasn't on here. Got a video coming up this weekend all about radios and comms. Now, I am not a comms expert by a long shot, so this is going to be a very bare bones introductory video. But as a follow-up to this video, now that I've set the foundation with this video I'm going to release on Sunday, I'll bring on a guest who knows a lot more about this than I do, because the world of home-based and mobile comms, not the walkie-talkie or handheld sorts, are very complex. But there is a way to learn how it works in a very easy way that we're going to talk about on Sunday. So stick with me for that. Thanks for all the support, guys. Help me get this channel to 500,000 subs, and let's take it to 1 million. Thanks for watching, folks. Canadian Prepper out. The best way to support this channel is to support yourself by gearing up at CanadianPreparedness.com, your one-stop shop for premium, high-quality, brand-name products. that have been tried and tested by myself and other YouTube gear reviewers. My subscribers save 10% off by using the coupon code SurvivalPrepper. All one word in all caps.